This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us again tonight Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck. Now, we've often, contemplated a political career for you, and I think consider the office of vice president as a possibility. However, it looks like there could be a more senior vacancy, could be in the offing, and I'm not sure you could just move in there without an election, or do you have to be elected? Could you be appointed?
Well, you
somehow as the
you see, actually, I was bribing and threatening Nancy Pelosi just the other day. So if the impeachment succeeds and Trump is removed and Pence moves up, then that leaves the vice presidency open for me.
That's a point.
Which was my grand design, which is why I've been resorting to bribery and threats.
Obviously, you've been paying substantial attention to these senior offices, and I mean, I wish you well on this, Bucky.
And I can make the transcripts of these conversations available.
I hesitate. You have a certain je ne sais quoi innocence about you. I don't know how well that would do up in Washington, where the long knives are out there. Well, having just gone through this little conversation, it's a good springboard, shall we say, segue into the issues of impeachment that are apparently fast approaching. And we're fortunate in that you have substantial experience in such a matter, and that in your younger days you opined quite a bit on the issue with Bill Clinton. So I will start off by asking you what sort of disinformation is being touted about now about what's going on. What exactly is happening?
Well, I think the disinformation is often born of partisanship and hyperbole. I've heard that the president has committed all of these crimes, by which I think people mean statutory offenses, except they can't produce the statutes. They mentioned that the president has committed treason. The president claims that the people trying to impeach him are committing treason, and this is very loose talk. I mean, these things have precise meanings, and to throw them around is I think, irresponsible and misleading, as well as misinformed.
Well, why haven't the pundits straightened the situation out? In other words, we depend. Everyone goes about their daily lives with its ups and downs, and many people. Most people don't have the time to get into the details, and if they have any chance at all, they flip onto their favorite news station, where pundits, I would say this, often say what's really happened and more or less attempt to tell them what to think. I hope that's not too broad of a brush to employ, but why haven't they said, look, let's go through some of the words here. That's nutty. That sounds okay. Try and be even-handed. Comments?
Well, I think there is some of that. It depends on the outlet you're looking at, whether you're looking at something that's in the middle versus something that's on the right or the left.
Well, what's in the middle, may I ask?
Not a whole lot these days,
There's not much in the middle where a person
really
can get disinterested information.
And my old mentor here at Mercer, since retired, Professor James Cox, has pointed out one of the catchphrases: you have to think for yourself, because if you don't, someone will think for you.
Well, and is that what's happening?
We have many institutions that are delighted to think for people.
Yes.
And thinking so hard, it takes so much energy.
It's much easier just to sort of, I don't know, yell and snort and throw a beer can against the wall or chew the carpet. The bad guy, that's a bad person. I dislike the person on the right or the left, and the news media seems to encourage this. So we've spoken in our conversations before about the centrifugal force in the country, the dangers that beset our republic, and it's certainly unseemly that we're in this particular situation. But possibly we could just go through what the Constitution says and then what's actually happening in regards to fulfilling constitutional requirements?
Yes. Well, there are several different impeachment passages, some in Article 1 regarding Congress's function, some in Article 2 regarding who can be impeached and why, and then a few odd things here and there. But basically, the House of Representatives does the impeaching, which you might best think of as a counterpart to indictment.
And let's be sure on that subject, because
Yes.
just in the common parlance, well, if you're impeached, that's it. You've been thrown out.
Impeachment means to be thrown out. Yes.
Right.
No,
That's what.
absolutely not.
And the word on the street is, well, should we throw the president out? And but that's a two-part process.
Yes.
And maybe you could just continue on the subject.
Well, after you have an indictment, you have to have a trial, and
Yes.
this is where the Senate comes in.
So there is the indictment is by no means a trial.
No, it's an official charge of wrongdoing.
Yes.
And this is what the House must do. And it's not always been the case, but these days and for the past 100 years or so, the normal way that the House of Representatives does that is to have the Judiciary Committee vote on articles of impeachment to come up with the actual charges. And then the entire House considers them and votes on them. And if a majority of the entire House approves those articles, then or any of them, then the person being charged has in fact been impeached, and we move on to the trial stage.
Now, we were discussing earlier, there have actually been only 2 impeachments of presidents. However, there have been many federal officials, judges that have been impeached, and so there is kind of a procedure, a due process that's been established by time and circumstance. Is that
Yes.
correct? I mean, there's just the tradition of the way that's been done. It's not spelled out exactly.
Yes.
I mean, there's no reason you couldn't do it differently.
To a degree. There have been, to answer your first question or observation, there have been about 19 federal impeachments, depending on how you count. Sometimes you'll get a resignation just before the impeachment is preferred. The best example of that was Richard Nixon, Secretary of War Belknap, and a few others. Most of these have been federal judges. You've had 2 presidents, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, actually impeached, but neither one was convicted. We'll talk more about that later. As to your second point, well, impeachment looks very judicial. You've got the charge, you've got the trial, you've got the fact that the Senate, and the Senate is where the trial takes place. Senators
Yes.
collectively serve as judge and jurors. And the Constitution is shot through with words like oath, trial, conviction, and various other terms of legal art that makes it sound very much like a judicial proceeding. On the other hand, politics has very clearly and very obviously played a major role in many impeachments.
Well, just to go through this, I mean, it's a real complicated process. And it's been, I'll just say this, in the newspaper, President Trump says, well, I have the right to confront my accuser. And so presumably there's some common law issues out there that can we make any heads or tails of this? The whistleblower legislation presumably protects the identity of an accuser.
Yes.
And does that, I would say, what do I know, in common law, English you certainly should be able to do that, although I think often in sexual assault cases, that's not the right, that you can't confront your accuser in university circumstances. You might be thrown out for allegations of sexual misconduct, and you cannot confront or often even only barely know the identity of the accuser.
Yes.
Comments?
Well, it depends. There are 2 or 3 levels here. The Sixth Amendment, which also applies not just to the federal government but to the state governments, does have the confrontation clause that you do have a right to confront the witnesses against you. Now, impeachment is pretty clearly not a criminal prosecution, so technically the Sixth Amendment would not apply to it. But you have to ask, what is the rationale behind the confrontation clause or the assistance of counsel clause or the presumption of innocence? And we have these things because they have been found to work. They've been found to keep, if you will, the mob from running wild. So for instance, during the Kavanaugh hearings,
Yes.
when the Democrats were going after Kavanaugh, they kept on saying over and over again, this is not a trial, this is a job interview. And of course they were intimating that due process was simply not applicable. And my reply to that would be, well, it might not be technically applicable, but it's good practice. It's a good way to make sure that we are rational about things and considered and have cool judgment. So I would say the same thing is true of impeachment.
Well, you mentioned a word that often I wouldn't apply to Washington, cool judgment.
Unfortunately.
Do we imagine that there is cool judgment employed on either side in Washington, the level of innuendo and just general anger, frustration, just a terrible sense of imbalance,
Yes.
I could say on both sides, but that level of imbalance, isn't that a little shaky on something so serious as doing this? If a federal judge, a lesser person, was just being, the idea was to lynch the federal judge for whatever reason, for political reasons, maybe he did something that was offensive, it doesn't seem appropriate to do anything rather than be coolly passionate, or impassionate rather, about the circumstances. And I think the Democrats are attempting to say we're coolly rational here. But the general tenure of just listening to the hearings is anything but that on both sides. And each side provokes one another. It's kind of like something out of the French Revolution to go through this interchange, the impeachment interchange.
Yes.
Maybe it was more civilized for Bill Clinton, and of course, I'm making a joke here.
Well, I would say that this is a horrible indictment. It was. And,
Really?
and if you remember how partisan and how passionate and how foaming at the mouth people were then,
Yes.
It's a terrible thing when I say that I think that this is worse. But politics for the last several years has been, and I think you would concur with this, I hope you would, it is the worst I have seen in my life. I think it's the worst you've probably seen in your life. There have been occasions when it has been worse in American history, but it's been very rare that they've reached this level. And I think that's terrible. But to give you a little perspective here, and the Andrew Johnson impeachment comes to mind immediately, but for the first 100 years after the Constitution was put into effect, the impeachment always came first. The House voted the impeachment, and then only afterwards drafted the articles.
Yes.
And that strikes me as being very partisan and politically
Yes,
driven.
indeed.
So,
Did that go for judges too? Or,
yes.
Or Secretary of War Belknap, who I just have to ask, who was Secretary of War Belknap? Presumably it was Secretaries of Wars aren't around anymore, so who and what was his crime?
Yeah, Secretary of War was essentially in command of the Army until I believe the National Security Act of 49, I think,
Yes.
at which point Navy and Army were merged into Defense
It's a rather
Departments.
nice title, Secretary of
War,
War.
yes.
Right, it doesn't sound too touchy-feely.
Yes, no, not at all. Defense is so much more
yes.
politic. Belknap, I believe, was Grant's Secretary of War, and I can't remember the exact charge, but given that it was the Grant years,
Right.
it was probably some sort of corruption. He was
Stealing
making
money,
money
yes.
on the side. And if I remember correctly, the impeachment may have been actually voted and then Belknap resigned before there was a trial.
Yes.
Or it was either that or the impeachment was about to be voted and he resigned. It was one of the two, but it never got to trial.
Now, if we can return just to what the American people should require, well, I think we could both say this is too important. It's just very injurious to the Republic to just be cavalier about taking someone out of office. The requirement, as I can recollect it, is high crimes and misdemeanors, which are the two are not exactly the same. High crime, does that mean a felony? Misdemeanors, does this mean a legal definition of, is there some violation? Here is the article that you violate. We have the drunk driving, whatever it is, you were found intoxicated twice or whatever. I mean, I don't know. There are millions and millions of possible crimes out there.
Yes.
And millions of possible misdemeanors.
Yes.
Can you remove a federal official from office because of that? Could you remove a judge, a federal sitting judge, for, I don't know, a drunken driving charge? I mean, could he be impeached for that reason? I mean, or any, I mean, I don't know, whatever, jaywalking? Could you take someone out
this is the $64. This is the gold standard of problems when you come to impeachment. The actual wording is that the president, the vice president, and all civil officers shall be impeachable and removable for treason, and here's the quotation, treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And that's just the amount of ink that has been spilled over that phrase. The first question is where that phrase comes from, and it comes from the English law. I won't say common law, but from the law of Parliament, and it dates back probably to the 1300s.
Yes.
Secondly,
well, I mean, just to go there for a second.
Yes.
Could it be possible to remove a king's official? I don't know. We'll pick a year. There are all kinds of lurid events in English history.
Oh, yes.
But okay, the kings often ran the show, and they had I don't know, some member of his court that was stealing money. How would he be removed? I mean, the king, would he have a trial? Could the king just say, "That's it, you're out of here"? Could Parliament do it? Could the English legals, who would bring the charges? And then the king's person could be appointed by the king. Some other arrangement could happen to take the person out.
Yes. Well, prior to the 1600s, early 1700s, there was always an ongoing power struggle between the crown and Parliament. And that's really one of the things that led to our idea of separation of powers and restrained government, that sometimes you would find a king being too powerful, sometimes you'd find Parliament being too powerful, but over the long haul, the power tended to even out. And compare that to, say, Germany, when there was no single German potentate, even with the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
The separate states had too much power. Whereas in France, the king was absolute. You did not have that balance in either one of those. Whereas in England, you over the long haul struck the balance. Well, Parliament's way of asserting itself against an overbearing king was the power of impeachment. That we can rise up and say, no, we are going to try as the high court of the land, the highest court.
The king's
the peers.
guys.
The peers, yes. And that's where the phrase jury of your peers comes from, because the peerage will decide the fate in a trial of one of these malcreants.
Well, after running around that issue
Yes.
for a bit, you mentioned some possible charges. The first one would be treason.
Yes.
Now, is there a definition of treason in the Constitution?
Yes. As a matter of fact, it is the only crime that is specifically defined in the Constitution. It says treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, being the United States, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them, the enemies, aid and comfort. So
now, good. Now, I'm
Yes.
happy we have a definition, and it's I've never almost ever heard such a conversation by the pundits. So, President Trump accuses his enemies of treason, and they accuse him of treason.
Yes.
And by that definition, neither would be appropriate. Is that fair?
Yes.
I mean,
And of course, this is the fun thing about law. You can take any word and or any definition and shake it hard enough and it'll fall apart. So the question is, what is levying war? I don't think there's any realistic argument
Neither
we're doing
side
that
is
here.
doing it, right.
A slightly more difficult one would be enemies. My guess would be that if you asked the founders, an enemy would be one with whom you have a declared war against. And certainly we do not have that here either.
Well, of course,
So-
enemies could be construed in any way you'd want to construe it. Well, it's as a better Olympic team. It's our enemies
Yes.
on the Olympic
So-
pitch, or maybe we're fighting over, I don't know, pork exports.
Or what about the domestic political enemies, if you really want to get subversive?
Well, let's ask that
So,
then.
yes.
Could you commit treason if you had domestic enemies that were attempting to undo the Constitution, and you then allowed them to do it? I mean, so from that point of view, could President Trump say, well, the Democrats are attempting to undo the Constitution, and against that, the Democrats would say, President Trump, you're undoing the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So still, a rational person would think this is just straight hyperbole, it's excessive, and it just has no, accusing your political opponents of treason is just ridiculous, isn't it? I mean,
Yes.
as far as what common sense would indicate.
Yes, and it's also the sign of a sick society and a sick polity, I should say, that the only times in our history when you have seen truly serious allegations of treason have been, first of all, when we were very young and still trying to establish ourselves, and secondly, when you actually saw the southern states secede from the Union. And so I think you could make an argument for treason in that case. Of course, Southerners would not say that. Southern whites certainly wouldn't.
Yes.
But it shows that we are horribly divided against ourselves, that we are afraid that our government lacks legitimacy, and so we bring the treason hammer down on our enemies. So when people start talking like this, it's a sign that something's rotten in Denmark.
Well, just to keep going on the treason arrangement, I mean, that's a very inappropriate use of words, but presumably, if it could be just a hammer to break the country apart. If your conception of what the country was or is pretty rigorous, and let's say it's treason to not build the wall or to build the wall. I mean, it's just treason is, well, we have these laws. If we don't enforce the laws, okay. And then the other side is, well, the country, it's part of our national ethos to let needy people in our society. So that's really, really a problem. And maybe we can move past that to go to the next word there, terminology, which is bribery.
Yes.
So it's a two-edged sword again, isn't it? So the Democrats, in some ways, are accusing President Trump of bribery, of attempting to bribe a foreign official with use of U.S. taxpayer money to help his cause.
Yes.
And contrary-wise, I guess President Trump is saying, I'm trying to get to the bottom of the bribery on the other side here. Can we parse that out? Bribery? What is bribery? What does it require?
Yes.
Seems to be from legal point of view, it's probably relatively
it's pretty straightforward.
established.
Yes. I believe that usually when the founders were talking about bribery, they were thinking about an official accepting a bribe, and thus his judgment was no longer independent judgment. But
what about a family member?
Well, yeah. So,
I mean, could bribery? I mean, and I think just looking at the newspaper, there was a congressman who used inside information to help his son, and
yes.
then was convicted for that. So presumably, if you are finding a way to influence U.S. policy for financial, and I think the crucial, we could even explore that. Does bribery, is that limited to money, or it could be, I want my son-in-law to get a gold medal from Romania or whatever.
I think
or you know, be a statue put up of
yes,
my mother in Bucharest or what.
Yes.
I mean,
I don't see any reason why it can't be in kind
Yes.
as opposed to in cash or money. And I don't see any reason why it must be limited to accepting things compromising your judgment. If you can show that you have acted in a way that is beyond the scope of your power, to use that power for personal gain, which is, I think, what the Democrats are arguing here. Presidents conduct foreign relations. They grant and withhold all the time.
Yes.
And presumably presidents do this with an eye to maximizing their reelection chances. I mean, if we live in a democratic system, which I think we actually live in a republic, but if we live in a majoritarian system, then what's wrong with the president acting in a way that is reflective of what a majority of the people want in order to get himself reelected? And at one level, that's what Trump is doing. The problem comes with, is he somehow using it in a way to give himself some sort of personal edge in the political system that's going to reelect him? At what point does it become a situation where you say, no, this violates the rules of the game? So.
well, are the rules spelled out? You know, you mentioned, I would say that if you're going to do something so extraordinary as to remove a president, then it ought to be pretty well stated, a pretty bright line kind of violation of a pretty bright line. But in general, is it fair to say that a politician, along with his mother's milk, knows how to do the deal, how to get benefit for his side, for himself, for his family, somehow for his political party, it just is there. And it would be very, very unusual to look at a president that conducted a foreign policy for which no benefit accrued to, he never considered the benefit that would happen to his party personally, his son-in-law, whatever. So just in general terms, it seems to be that every politician would be practicing to some degree this kind of behavior. The question would be, where is the bright line, and a really rigorous bright line that a politician who's used to doing things like putting a dam in his home district or getting his brother-in-law a job with some local corporation, or considering what's going to happen in retirement when he no longer is in office. Is he going to go to work as a lawyer for a, quote, a firm that does lobbying and basically be a lobbyist? And during his time in office, he's just cultivating friendships, how to do this, how to do that, and the circle of benefit is out there. But it's and I would say fairly, we could talk about that in another session, not too well exposed. But all right, having sort of run around the track on that issue, the bribery part of this. I guess the accusation against the president is, if we're going to say this bribery is going to be one of the charges against him, that he accepted, I guess he withheld benefit from the Ukraine to help injure his opponent.
Yes.
Now.
So.
We're going to have to just, we've had an interesting conversation. I believe we'll have to continue it.
I think so. We've just scratched the surface on this one.
Right, we've scratched the surface now. Right, any final words on bribery, the influence of money and politics? And are there I wonder if there are any politicians out there that might be just worried about whether or not they have obtained some kind of benefit from their office that would violate our very high standards. Any final comment?
Nothing I can really think of in the short time we have left, except to say that we're getting to the point where law intersects politics. So I would suggest that we continue on to high crimes and misdemeanors, which is the joker in the pack in our next segment. where we'll really get into that intersection.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, Bud, for
Thank
being
you.
with us tonight.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.